I'm Dr. Karin Varblow. I'm a pediatrician with expertise in attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and its related conditions. I've been a pediatrician for about almost 20 years now. For the first 10 of those years, I worked as a general pediatrician. And after that, I decided to really subspecialize in ADHD and opened my practice, my solo practice, to treat ADHD specifically 7 years ago. And I'm very, very happy to be with you all tonight. It is no secret to any of my patients or their families that I myself have been diagnosed with ADHD. My children have ADHD. I essentially have worn all of the hats around ADHD. I've been an untreated patient who was undiagnosed up until I was close to 30 years old. I've been a treated and diagnosed and treated patient. I've been a pediatrician. I've been a mom to people with ADHD. I've been a spouse to someone with ADHD. Before I was a pediatrician, I was a social worker, and I worked with populations of people who, in retrospect, I learned in whom ADHD was overrepresented. I taught for a while before I was a social worker, and I worked again with students with ADHD. So I kind of have all the hats covered. And at some point, about a decade into my career as a general pediatrician, it dawned on me that I could really pull a lot of that experience together and have something to offer to families by really focusing down on ADHD. So that's what I do. In the process of sort of designing my own practice, I thought a lot about what we as a field know and don't know about ADHD. And I found that there were lots of questions that I had that couldn't be quickly and easily answered in the existing literature. And that's what prompted me to sort of go on the journey that I'm going to share with you all tonight. So let's start off, Michaela, we can go to the next slide. Let's start off with just a very basic definition of ADHD. You will hear me use ADHD and ADD interchangeably throughout this talk. It used to be a few years ago that there were two separate diagnoses, two separate disorders. That distinction has been done away with. Now there is one disorder, and it's called ADHD. There are different presentations. So some people have a hyperactivity component and some people do not, but it's all different categories of one diagnosis, ADHD. Some of us just still use the old nomenclature. The definition of ADHD, and this is paraphrased, but essentially ADHD is a disability characterized by a persistent or ongoing pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity and impulsivity that is impairing in some way. It gets in the way of daily life or of typical development. Some of the ways that ADHD can affect people include they may have difficulty maintaining attention, beginning activities, getting started, organizing, managing tasks, working memory. And these are sort of broad categories. But the thing that I want you to remember as we go through this definition in more detail is that the impairments and the deficits that are included in all of the further descriptions that I'm going to go through really apply only to non-preferred tasks. Okay, so when those of us with ADHD are doing things that we enjoy doing and that are interesting to us and compelling, we don't have much impairment. We're pretty much on the ball and we do pretty well. The problem is when we are asked to do tasks that are not our favorites, that we really don't enjoy, that we don't think are all that important. They're not very compelling. They're not very interesting. They may be important to somebody else, but they're not important to us. That's when we run into trouble. Okay, and I want you to keep that in mind as we go through the rest of this slide presentation, because that's really important. Keep in mind that ADHD is neurobiological and neurodevelopmental in origin. It is genetically determined for the most part. It can have 3 different presentations: primarily inattentive, primarily hyperactive impulsive, and a combination. The combination is the most common. Inattentive is the second most common, and primarily hyperactive impulsive is the least common of the 3 presentations. Okay, next slide. Let's talk about the inattentive presentation. Okay, there are certain symptoms that we may find. No one individual patient or student will necessarily have all of these symptoms or characteristics if they have inattentive presentation of ADHD, but these are some of the things that we may find. Trouble paying close attention to details, making careless mistakes, maintaining attention over a long, prolonged period of time to tasks or activities, again, that are non-preferred activities. Not appearing to listen when spoken to directly, generally when spoken to directly about non-preferred activities. Not following through on instructions, losing focus, failing to complete assignments, chores, homework, etc. Trouble organizing tasks and activities. Avoiding tasks that require sustained mental effort or reluctance to get started. Misplacing things that are necessary for these jobs that we never wanted to do in the first place. Getting easily distracted, or being forgetful. Okay. Again, if you think about these qualities in terms of your child and his or her ability to play with Legos for hours and hours and hours on end, you're not going to see any evidence of ADHD. But if you think of these things in reference to your child, when your child is asked to do things that they have not much interest in doing, that's where the distinction is made. Next slide, please, Michaela. The next set of symptoms are the hyperactive impulsive symptoms. Again, we're going to see these primarily with non-preferred tasks. Fidgeting or squirming, inability to sit still, even when we know it's expected. Running or climbing in situations when it's not appropriate. That's what we tend to see in hyperactive or impulsive young children. In adolescents or adults, we may not actually see the running or climbing, but they may experience this internally as restlessness. An inability to play quietly, specifically when told to do so, right? Not when it's what we feel like doing. Constantly feeling on the go, talking excessively, just chatter, 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 interrupting, blurting out an answer before a question has been completely asked. Trouble waiting turn, intruding on others' space or on others' verbal speaking. Okay, next slide. Actually, okay, so I'm gonna have you, Michaela, if you wouldn't mind, just go back one if you wouldn't mind. Okay, so have any questions come in through the chat about any of these definitions so far, Michaela?
No, ma'am.
Okay, super, thank you. So now let's go on to the next slide. Here's, those definitions that I just read to you and all those criteria are the basis on which we make a diagnosis, but they don't give us much information about what is really happening inside the minds of people with ADHD. What is ADHD really all about, right? We can recognize these criteria and these characteristics. It doesn't really tell us much about who these individuals are and how they think. And that was the piece that I really wanted to dig into when I first sort of contemplated opening a practice dedicated to ADHD. And what I wanted to do in order to really sort through that was look at how individuals with ADHD, regardless of whether they have inattentive presentation, hyperactive impulsive presentation, combination. How do those individuals compare to individuals without ADHD? Because there is something that everybody with ADHD seems to have in common. Although, if you have an inattentive presentation, you may share no qualities and no symptoms with somebody with a hyperactive impulsive presentation, and yet it's the same disorder and we recognize it when we see it as ADHD. But what is that thing that we're recognizing, and why do both of those individuals fall under the same umbrella term as having the diagnosis of ADHD? So let's talk about people without ADHD for just a moment. Okay, and let's think about how they make decisions and how they sort of proceed through choosing their behaviors throughout an ordinary day. And in order to do that, we're going to talk about two different sort of parts of the brain. This is conceptual. This is not neuroanatomy. This is not something that you can sort of point to on an MRI of the brain. This is just conceptual. But the way I think of it, we really are talking about two different parts of the brain here. We're talking about the part of the brain that I call the know, K-N-O-W part of the brain. And that's where we keep the information, the things that we know. Okay? The list of spelling words that we memorized for the quiz on Friday lives in the know part of the brain. The rules, the classroom rules, the rules for home, the rules for the soccer field, the shoulds, the ways that one is sort of supposed to behave, even if they're not written and explicit rules. It also contains things like your moral code, your value system, your intentions, your understanding of what are the likely consequences. If I behave in X way, is that likely to end well or not well, compared to if I behave in Y manner? Your goals for the things you want to get done later on this afternoon, and the things you want to get done later in life, or the things that you hope to have happen later in your life, the things you want to achieve later in life. Okay, essentially, all of these things sort of represent your inner self, your heart of hearts, your intentions, and really who you are deep down inside as an accumulation of what sense you make out of the information that you have gathered over your lifetime. Okay? So that lives in one part of the brain. Another part of the brain, I call the go part of the brain. There's no thinking that happens in the go part of the brain. The go part of the brain is all about behavior. And I think of it as sort of the accelerator and the brake and the steering wheel of the car. So if somebody comes to a fork in the road and needs to make a decision, for example, a kid comes home from school at the end of a day and they consider what they know. They know they're tired. They've had a long day at school. They're kind of done. They're hungry. They have a lot of homework to do. They have a test tomorrow. There are lots of things that they know. And ultimately, they have a choice to make. And it could boil down to something like, I can either just power through, get my work done, and then be done for the night. And at that point, really relax, let myself refresh, rejuvenate, get some food, chill out for the rest of the evening. Or I could take a break, get some food, have some downtime, let my brain refresh, and then dive into the homework a little bit later once I've had some time to recollect. And there are pros and cons to either approach. The thinking about which of those paths I want to take might happen in the know part of my brain, but the actual sort of going to the right, going to the kitchen instead of to the place where I do my homework, And the actual getting out the bag of potato chips and opening up the phone and going to my solitaire game of choice or going to social media or whatever it is, all of that behavior is driven by the go part of my brain. Okay? So in a person without ADHD, as I said, they may get home at the end of the day from school. They know they have homework to do. They know they're really tired. They're hungry. Which pathway should I take? And they consider everything that they know. I know that I could really use a break. I also know that if I take a break, I'm at risk of having trouble getting back into sort of school mode and getting back into the place where I can focus and do my homework. I know that I'm tired and could use a break. I also know that once I'm in school mode, if I just power through, sometimes that works better, even if I'm tired. And then I can just rest and be finished for the rest of the night once I've completed my homework. So pros and cons. The person without ADHD would sort of weigh this and consider what they know, what they've learned with previous experimentation, and maybe they decide to take a break. They take a break, get some food, chill out for a little bit, get on their phones, maybe get a breather, and then dive back into their homework. Maybe that works well, maybe it doesn't work well. Either way, they learn something. Note to self, that was a great plan. I should always just take a break, get some food, have 45 minutes to myself before I dive into my homework. Or maybe the note to self says something like, let's not try that ever, ever, ever again. That did not end well. When I get home from school, I'm really better off just going straight to my room, getting my homework done, and then taking my break once I have everything completed. Either way, note to self, tomorrow comes, I'm back at the front door, I've just come home from school, and I have the same dilemma, the same fork in the road. I can think back to what notes I made to myself yesterday and make a decision that includes those notes and that information that I learned yesterday, apply that to today, and move forward. Okay? Any questions about that? That's sort of the way probably 90-ish% of the population makes their decisions and goes through their day. Okay, if no questions there, let's go on to the next slide, please. Super. All right, so now we're going to take a look at the brain of somebody with ADHD. And this can be somebody with hyperactive impulsive presentation, with primarily inattentive presentation, or with combined presentation. Essentially, let's take that same scenario. Person gets home from school, and at some level they know they have homework to do, they know they have a test tomorrow, they know they're hungry, they know they're tired. But rather than sort of pause and weigh their choices and figure out which fork in the road is going to be the most likely to work out well, here's what happens. They end up in the kitchen, and a long time has gone by since they went to the kitchen. The full family-sized bag of potato chips is empty. They've played, endless rounds of solitaire. They've looked through social media from top to bottom, have learned just have wasted hours and hours and hours. And ultimately, an adult may come into the room and say, oh my gosh, have you already finished your homework? No. Have you been sitting here this whole time? Yeah. Didn't you know that you have homework to do? Don't you remember you have a test tomorrow? Yes. And inevitably the question comes, what were you thinking? What were you thinking in sitting here for all of these hours on your phone eating potato chips rather than doing your homework? And honestly, the honest answer, when we get right down to it, the honest answer is, oh, I wasn't thinking. I just looked up when you came in the room and realized it had been a few hours. And yep, now that you mentioned it, I do see the potato chip bag is empty. And I do see that, I've been on my phone for all this time. And that test sufficiently. I see that. The next question out of the adult's mouth might be, don't you know better than that? Yes, I do. Now we're back to question 1. Well, then what were you thinking? Why did you do this? Again, we've had this conversation umpteen bazillion times before. Why is it that, again, I find you in the kitchen with the empty bag of potato chips, blah, 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 blah. Honest answer again? Oh, not a parent's favorite response. Okay, I grant you, but it is the honest answer. The difference between the person with ADHD and the person without has to do with the connectivity between the no part of the brain and the go part of the brain. Both individuals have the same information in their knowledge bank. It's not that the person with ADHD doesn't know that wasting several hours before doing their homework and trying to study for their test, et cetera, is a bad idea. They know that, right? It's not as if they don't know that they have a test tomorrow. They've slipped their mind for a moment, but ultimately that information was there in the no part of their brain somewhere. They know that they're not going to do very well on that test if they don't study, right? All of the information is there in both individuals. And in both individuals, the steering wheel works, the brakes work, the accelerator works. Both individuals have the ability to go to one path or the other and put the brakes on the other and accelerate down the chosen path. The difference is in the choosing. The person without ADHD made a choice about how to move forward through their afternoon. The person with ADHD found themselves down at the end of the path to the right without ever having made a decision about whether or not they wanted to go there. It's just where they ended up. Oh, look at that. It's hours later. Potato chip bag empty. Social media, thoroughly scoured. And no homework done. How did I get here? Oh, okay. The difference is in the connectivity between the no part of the brain and the go part of the brain. For individuals without ADHD, their behavior is an accurate reflection most of the time of what is in the no part of their brain. What is in their heart of hearts? What are their intentions? What is their moral code? What's their value system dictate? Okay, but in the person with ADHD, the behavior does not necessarily reflect what's in the no part of the brain. It only reflects where they ended up. And that is a really key difference. Okay. And it can be a key difference in 3 primary ways. Michaela, can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. I think there are 3 consequences, ultimately, of spending significant periods of time with undiagnosed and untreated or undertreated ADHD. And essentially that means 3 consequences of having a disconnect between your no and your go much of the time, much of your life. The first is that you learn that you can't necessarily trust yourself to behave in accordance with your own moral code. Here's an example. Maybe I, as a person with ADHD, am someone who feels very strongly that it is important to always be kind. That's something that I value highly, and it's really that's a meaningful thing to me. And yet, if I'm a blurter and I don't have much control over what comes out of my mouth and when it comes out of my mouth, I may find myself saying things that are not particularly kind or sensitive. And that inconsistency can be really damaging to the self-esteem. Another example might be if I'm somebody who really wants to do well in school, and I really, value education highly, and I want to please my parents and my teachers and so on and so forth. And yet, whenever I open up a textbook to study, my attention goes to Disney World or somewhere way more fun than whatever's in the textbook that I'm trying to read and memorize right now. Okay? Even though what I know is if my brain doesn't stay focused on what I'm reading, I'm not going to be very successful at studying. So I am telling my brain the whole time, stay focused, pay attention to what your eyes are reading because this matters. You need to process what you're reading. And if my brain says, see ya, and goes off to Disney World anyway, despite the fact that I highly value my education and so on and so forth, my brain went, and the resulting behavior, I don't do well on the test, makes it look as if I don't value the education and that I don't care. And there are many, many other examples of ways in which we learn early on that we can't necessarily trust ourselves to behave in accordance with our own value systems and moral codes. Okay. Second consequence may be feeling alienated and isolated from other people. None of us has our moral codes stamped on our foreheads. That's just not the way humans come out into the world, right? So the only way that we can learn of each other's intentions and what kind of a person someone that you meet is by observing their behavior. It's really all you have. They can tell you all day long that they're a very, very kind person, but ultimately you decide if you believe them or not based on how they behave. And if they tell you all day long that they value kindness, and yet they say mean things or insensitive things or thoughtless things that hurt people's feelings, we're going to question whether or not they actually value kindness very highly, right? And when that happens, we end up making assumptions about the person's sort of inner self and their intentions and their moral code based on how they behave. We make assumptions that are incorrect or that may be incorrect much more often than we would in somebody whose intentions are consistent with their behavior and vice versa. Okay, so when we see this disconnect between what the person may say they value and how they behave, we're going to trust the behavior over what they say they value. And that's going to mean that we're going to misunderstand and misconnect with or disconnect with these people at sort of a deep personal level, leaving the person with ADHD to feel isolated and misunderstood. Okay. The third consequence is really kind of an extension of that, which has to do with the fact, based on the fact that the way children develop their sense of self, their identities, their sense of who they are, what kind of person, individual they are, is by looking in the mirror that the world holds up to them. And we teach children to do this all the time. We say, oh, you're so sweet to take care of your little brother or sister like that. Thank you. Thank you for helping mommy do the dishes. What a sweet thing that is that you did for me. you're such a sweetheart, or I'm so proud of you for doing so well on your spelling tee. You are a good speller. We hold up this mirror, and children come to identify with those reflections, okay? If, however, the reflection that's being held up is not only inaccurate, as it may be due to consequence number 2 that we just talked about, not only is it inaccurate, but it's really not very flattering. It's really kind of not nice, right? And the reflection shows a child who is insensitive, who is stupid, who is disrespectful, who is mean, right? Who is selfish. The litany of sort of mirror images that people with ADHD see in the mirrors that are held up to them throughout childhood is extensive, but there are certain trends, and there tend to be not flattering trends. Okay, so now we end up with someone who feels like they can't really trust themselves to understand what kind of a person they are, because they may think of themselves as one kind of person, but they see that they behave in the ways of another kind of person. They feel alienated and disconnected from the people around them who don't really get them. And worse than that, not only are they disconnected, but the world seems to really be kind of not nice to them. And that is the sort of cycle that can then keep going around and around and around and around and around, and further impair the development and progress of an individual with ADHD when it's undiagnosed and untreated. Okay? Does that all make sense to everybody? Any questions there? Okay. Now, I want you to think about an individual that you may know who has ADHD. And I want you to think about them doing something that they love to do, something they're really pretty good at, and something which tends not to be difficult for them. I mentioned Legos because this is one of my favorite examples for little kids with ADHD. If they like playing with Legos and they like creating with Legos, here's the thing. Their behavior when they're playing with Legos tends to be very, very consistent with the no part of their brain. The go part of their brain when they're playing with Legos tends to be very consistent with the no part of their brain. They may make a plan for what they want to build. They may be able to sequence the steps that they need to take, gather up all of their supplies, proceed through all of those steps in order without being distracted and without getting bored and giving up, all the way to the end. And even when they're at the end and the only thing left is sort of the boring little piddly detail stuff, they follow up on all the boring little piddly details all the way to the end until the task is complete and they can take a bow. Okay? Compare that behavior to that same child maybe being asked to do their math homework or their writing homework. And you may see two very different kinds of behaviors, very different presentations. That is also, I think, a key piece that we often miss when we talk about ADHD. So I want to go on to the next slide, please, Michaela. And let's look at what happens when a person with ADHD is behaving when they get to do the things that they really enjoy doing, when they get to engage in preferred activities. Okay? Essentially, all of a sudden, their brains are stimulated. They're finding the activity to be exciting, engaging, fascinating, relevant. They think it's important. Maybe there's urgency. Maybe they really, really want to get this thing done because mom has said that if they're not finished by dinner, they don't get to finish. They have to wait until tomorrow. So they're on the clock. Maybe there's some fear. Maybe the box says that this is a project for kids who are 10 and up, and this child's only 8. So maybe there's a challenge in this and a little bit of fear that I might not be able to complete it. Maybe there's novelty, okay? Maybe they've never tried Legos before, and this is a whole new exciting project. Or maybe Legos is really their thing and they are passionate about Legos. And this is sort of where it's at for this child, okay? Whatever it is, there are certain conditions that make this brain feel stimulated and therefore make the brain connect the no and the go parts of itself so that the resulting behavior is actually consistent with the intentions and values of the child with regard to that activity. Okay? The bottom line here is stimulation equals motivation. So we can have the same kid who under some circumstances has a very well connected no and go brain. And under other circumstances, may have very little connectivity between the no and the go. As opposed to the individual without ADHD, who, regardless of whether the activity at question is a preferred activity or a non-preferred activity or something they're really passionate about or something they don't really care that much about, they're able to pull that no and go together and behave accordingly. For the person with ADHD, that connectivity is highly situationally dependent. Okay? And that, to me, is really the crux of the difference between those people with ADHD and those people without. It's not within our control if we have ADHD to pull that connectivity together or not. The thing that I want to emphasize is that when we treat ADHD, what we do is simulate stimulation. Okay? So when we're treating ADHD, we are essentially either providing medication that helps draw that no and go together, and or we are providing changes in circumstances. We're teaching people how to change their circumstances and their environments to further promote or better promote connectivity between the no and the go. Okay? And you see people, the kids who have ADHD and are forever waiting until the last possible minute, the procrastinators. And they can't get their homework done, and they can't get their homework done, and they can't get their homework done. And now it's the 11th hour, and all of a sudden, there's this mad rush and this mad chaos, and they're all of a sudden, feel like it's of utter importance that they get the homework done. Right? 3 weeks, the assignment has been there. And they've been saying, later, whatever, I'll get to it. And now that there's no time left, now it matters. And now they're all in. And that is essentially a way that they are using the urgency to pull the no and the go together. Because it's one of those situational variables that stimulates the brain. Whereas when it was 2 weeks before the assignment was due, there was no stimulation there. Any questions there? Super. Okay. So what I want to sort of now circle back and talk about, and Michaela, maybe we can go back to slide number 2. The very definition of ADHD. And let's read it again and talk about it again in the context of the no and the go. Okay, so again, the definition of ADHD, it's a disability characterized by a persistent or ongoing pattern of inattention or hyperactivity, impulsivity that gets in the way of daily life or typical development. So time after time after time after time, regardless of what I, as an individual with ADHD, may know to be in my own best interest, regardless of what I know to be in my own best interest, I behave in ways that show that I'm sort of getting in my own way. I'm impairing my own progress, despite the fact that I know better, is another way to say that. Over and over and over again, I'm getting in my own way. And specifically, I'm getting in my own way by not being able to keep my brain in the book that I'm trying to study, or by not being able to get myself up out of the couch and over to the books in the first place, or get myself torn away from my phone and social media and dive into the math homework. Or I may not be able to remember for the life of me where I wrote down what my math homework is, or if I wrote down what my math homework is. I may not be able to remember the explanation that the teacher gave in math class about how to do the problem set that I'm supposed to now be sitting down to do at homework time. There may be all these different ways that, despite what I know to be in my own best interest, I just can't get it together. And that could be manifested in inattention, with the example of, despite the fact that I read the entire chapter when I was studying for such and such a test, when the adult comes into the room and asks me what I learned when I studied, the honest answer could very well be, oh, right? Well, what was the chapter about? Oh, honest answer. My eyes read every word of the chapter. My brain was at Disney World the whole time. And I know better than that, but I didn't have the ability to control it. That would be sort of an inattentive type of presentation. Primarily hyperactive impulsive, again, might be the blurter who, before the teacher finishes asking the question, is shouting out the answer as they start to raise their hand, knowing full well that the sort of rule is you wait until the teacher has completed the question, then you raise your hand, and then once you're called on, you provide the answer. They may be able to, recite that sequence in their sleep, and yet, right? It may be that it looks something like, I know the teacher wants me to sit still, so I'm going to try really, really hard to sit still, even though, oh my gosh, I have an itch. And this seat is so hard, and I'm so uncomfortable, and I got a cramp in my leg. I know the teacher wants me to sit still, and yet, despite what I know to be in my own best interest, I just can't control my body from being all over the place. So there are different manifestations, but the thread that they all have in common is this lack of self-control in one way or another, and this lack of ability to consistently behave according to the ways, the guidelines that we give ourselves. Okay? And it specifically has to do with non-preferred activities. So now when you open up and think about all the myriad ways that this can impact people and what it can end up looking like, and you look at the outcomes of individuals who have not had their ADHD adequately treated, We see outcomes like higher degrees of school dropout, more trips to the emergency room, more car accidents, lower grades, lower income in adulthood, less promotion, more relationship difficulties, unintended pregnancies, substance abuse. And the list goes on and on and on. Essentially, every outcome that you can imagine is going to be worse in individuals with untreated or undertreated ADHD than in individuals who have ADHD, which is well managed. I will say most of those outcomes are going to be worse in individuals with ADHD than in individuals without ADHD. But if you compare apples to apples and you're looking only at individuals with ADHD and you're comparing those who are adequately treated to those who are inadequately treated, the outcomes are better in those who are adequately or more robustly treated every time. The thing that can also sort of blossom from living that life of lack of self-control and lack of connection to people around you, and having this constant sort of negatively skewed mirror that's being held up to you. We see a lot of anxiety. We see a lot of depression. We may see tics, right? We may see other forms or other disorders or other challenges that coexist with ADHD. And oftentimes, not always, but sometimes that is just a direct result of sort of being in this cycle of not having self-control and being blamed for not having self-control, and down and down and down and down we go. It can result in people having poor self-esteem. And if you combine poor self-esteem with impulsivity, we may, drive the people around us crazy by constantly seeking reassurance. Reassurance. Are you sure? Really? Is it good enough? Is it good? Whatever, right? And so then we're impairing the relationships further. We may see that happening, but then we get more anxious and we're more impulsive, and around and around and around and around we go. You can see how these things all seem to can feed each other. And the whole cycle can just kind of head further and further and further down the drain. Whereas when we give people the gift of self-control, the cycle really can reverse itself, and we can end up with much, much, much better outcomes. So those are the main points that I wanted to make for you all tonight. And I will be happy to take any questions at this point.
Dr. Varblow, we had a question pop up, I think right before we went back to slide 2, but I think it's referencing the procrastinating and waiting until the last minute, and that being stimulation. I believe Amy asked, is that similar to a bump of adrenaline, was her question.
Yes. Essentially, that is what that is. It may be, so another way to consider ADHD is in terms of sort of energy of activation, especially when it comes to getting started or just doing things that are not interesting, not fun, not relevant. It's really hard to get the energy up for working through those challenges. But if we wait until there's some other compelling reason, in other words, it may be that doing such and such a task is not one of my preferred activities, but it may be that avoiding flunking this class is one of my preferred activities. When the assignment is due in 2 weeks, it's all about whether or not I want to do the assignment. When the assignment is due tomorrow, and if I don't get it done tonight, I'm going to fail, And if I fail, I might flunk the class and have to take it again and endure this horrible, horrible, boring, distressing, awful experience for a second time. All of a sudden now I'm looking at a preferred activity because the adrenaline is the piece that makes it doable. So yes, it's all connected. Yes.
Hi, this has all been so interesting. So my question is kind of twofold. One is I've got an adolescent with ADHD, and we've known about it for quite a long time, and he's got an IEP. And I kind of laughed when they set up the IEP because one of the things they insisted on putting on there was something silly like the teachers will prompt him like no more than 3 times, and then like this will happen, as if somehow they could like, with this prompting system, make the ADHD go away. And I kind of argued at the time, like, you can't cure this, so the accommodations in an IEP are meant to always support him. They don't go away, they don't lessen, like they'll always be equal. So his IEP review is coming up, and I'm just wondering, like, what kind of wording, what kind of language can I use to help make his IEP really helpful to him and work with educators who aren't necessarily, I don't feel like, on the same page with understanding ADHD?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, when I'm working with high school and college kids, what I spend a lot of time working through with them is, I sort of ask them, tell me about the time that it all came together. Tell me about the time that it was down to the final minute and you were on the verge of flunking that class unless you aced that exam or were able to write the whole 10-page paper in one night, or whatever it is that sort of was the clutch moment and you pulled it together and were successful. Tell me about what that looked like. Were the lights bright and sort of stimulating, or were they kind of more dim and soothing? Was there music playing? Was the music coming from in front of you or behind you or in your earbuds? What kind of music? Were there lyrics? Did you do the work by yourself, or did you work with someone else, either a tutor or a peer or in a small group? I try to get as much information as I can. Were you working at home, or were you working, did you go to Starbucks to get the work done? Because at Starbucks, while some people might find it, inordinately distracting, other people find it inordinately stimulating because everybody's just getting things done. People are in there, they're getting the caffeine, they're getting out of there, the baristas are busy, right? And sometimes that energy can be contagious. So I try to get as much information as I can about what works for any one individual. And that's what I try to sort of feed into the IEP. So it might be that for one individual, having the teacher just sort of, knowing the teacher is just sort of there and ready to prompt is helpful in and of itself, because they're trying to avoid, right, the public prompt or whatever it is. For some other people, it might be that knowing the teacher is there, sort of just waiting to pounce with a prompt, is so distracting that they can't get anything done. So being able to work with the individual student and saying, knowing that the teacher is going to give 3 prompts and no more, and if they get to the 3rd prompt and you still don't do X, Y, and Z, there is a consequence. Does that help you, or is that counterproductive? And essentially asking the student, what would be supportive? What would help you be more likely to be successful? Because I think what happens often in schools is there's just this sort of generic list that they pull out and say, okay, the IEP, the person that has ADHD, all right, the IEP is going to be this, 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 and this, without really understanding how any one individual student may respond well or poorly to any one intervention. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it definitely is. Then one other quick kind of follow-up. So as a parent, how, and as they get to be older too, like I'm trying to learn to start turning things over to him, but I don't want to like drop the net. So like, how do you make that shift? Like, how do you, I don't know.
Yeah, no, that is the question for parents around the universe. What I would say, sort of one of the like bumper stickers to remember is what you can expect on an ordinary day is what you can expect on an ordinary day. All of these kids will have flashes of brilliance. There will always be the day when you don't give any support and they just thrive, they just shine, right? Everything gets done in advance, right? And perfectly, and everything works out beautifully. And so then you expect, oh, cool, I no longer have to support the morning routine. Clearly, so-and-so is able to set his own alarm, get up on time, get his own breakfast, and be at the door, ready to go 2 minutes before we actually need to walk out the door. Awesome. Yay, I'm done. So then the next morning, we don't check to make sure they're awake. We don't, and we walk in 5 minutes after they're supposed to be out the door and they're still asleep. What is this, right? Rather than set the bar with those flashes of genius, we want to set the bar at the ordinary day. And when the ordinary day shows us that we can let go a little bit and they don't fall apart, that's how much support they need, right? It's very trial and error, but in really micro steps. And what we have to remember is when these kids do something right, we can't hold that against them for the rest of their lives. Okay? We really have to remember how they function on the average day and support them accordingly.
Dr. Varblow, I wanted to chime in with another question that came through the chat, which might be the same answer as you just stated, but the question is, how can parents learn to parent these children so that they don't make the child feel worse about themselves? I feel like it's a constant fight.
No, that's a great question, and it is a different answer. And I'm glad it was asked, because what I didn't go into tonight is all of the ways that having an ADHD diagnosis is fantastic news, okay? As long as I've been in the field of ADHD, I've met thousands of individuals with ADHD, and I have yet to meet one who doesn't have at least one arena or sort of domain in which they have truly remarkable abilities. Truly remarkable. Okay? And the domain is different from individual to individual. It's not as if all people with ADHD have remarkable abilities to memorize, the Gettysburg Address. But each and every individual I've met has some remarkable ability that is really unique and really just above and beyond what would be expected. So when kids come to me for the first time, I am all about congratulations. Congratulations on your diagnosis of ADHD. This is great news, because here's what it means. Granted, those of us with ADHD have some struggles, right? There are some things that are harder for us than they are for most of the rest of the world. And those things might be staying organized, getting things done on time, whatever, keeping track of our stuff, inhibiting blurting. There are things that we may find more difficult than most people seem to find them. There are also things that are much easier for us than they are for the average person out there. Okay, so here's how I sort of do this visually. For 90-ish% of the population, there are some things that are a little bit easier for them than they are for most people. And there are some things that are a little bit harder for them than they are for most people. And for the most part, they live sort of between a little hard and a little easy, somewhere in this range. Those of us with ADHD, while some things may be really significantly harder for us than they are for most people, some things are significantly easier and just come naturally to us in a way that they don't come naturally to most people. So we tend to live in this broader range. Here's where the really good news happens. When we treat the ADHD, we don't touch these gifts. We don't touch these remarkable abilities that are way out here. What we do is make the things that are more difficult easier. Okay? So my job is to take the things that you, as an individual with ADHD, find just like harder than they're supposed to be, harder than they should be, hard for some reason that's like an unidentified reason. They're just hard. I can make those things easier for you. And then you end up living sort of in this range. Remember where the rest of the world lives? In this range. Okay, so if most of the world lives here, and we can get you to live here, who wins? The person with ADHD wins. Okay? And we can do that. That's my job. I have the best job in the world because I get to just make the hard things easier so that you come out ahead. I do think it's really important to emphasize the strengths and the gifts that these kids just are born with. And then getting them to buy into treatment and complying with their medication plans, or showing up to the doctor's appointments, or whatever it is that they need to do, is all about just making their lives easier. And I find that most kids are pretty quick to sign on to anything that's going to make their lives easier.
Dr.
And it doesn't
Varblow.
have to be a fight. Yep.
Oh, sorry. A follow-up question to that first question that I asked. When you talk about treating ADHD, are you referring to medicine or therapy or both?
Great question. There's one really enormous long-term study that was started probably close to 20 years ago now, multi-center study done in the US that looked at hundreds of kids over time. And essentially what they found was that there are three things that tend to work well to treat individuals with ADHD over time in large numbers. One is medication. Another is behavior modification, and we'll talk more about what that is. And the third is the combination of both of those things. The thing that works best is the combination. Using medication and behavior modification is what works best. Second best is medication alone. Third best is behavior modification alone. Now, I do want to spend a minute on behavior modification because this is something that is so often misunderstood. Oftentimes, parents will tell me that they've had their child in behavior modification therapy for a year and it just hasn't helped, and they're really frustrated. And what I think is a common misconception is that the way to get behavior modification therapy is to send your child out for it. When in fact, behavior modification therapy at least for children, I would say sort of high school and below, is all about training the parents to elicit different behaviors from their children. Okay? So behavior modification therapy is something that the parents engage in so that they can parent their children in ways that ultimately get better results. Okay? It doesn't mean that children with ADHD don't benefit from therapy. They absolutely can benefit from therapy, but they don't necessarily have great odds of benefiting from behavior modification specific therapy without medication. Because as we talked about, you may know all the rules, and you may know, you as the individual with ADHD may know what's in your best interest if you stop and think about it. And you may know what to do and what not to do. And yet that knowledge may have absolutely zero impact on your behavior when it matters. So spending lots of time, money, energy, resources, teaching kids the rules that they may or may not already know tends not to be as beneficial as teaching the parents how to parent in ways that are more likely to get different results and different behaviors out of their kids, and combining behavior modification therapy with medication for the children so that then the no and the go can come together. And as the children learn more and as the parents learn more, that knowledge impacts the go. And now we're ending up with better results.
We have a few more questions, Dr. Varblow. Joyce is asking, my child refuses to take any medication or return to counseling. Do you have any suggestions of how to handle this?
That's a tough one for me to answer without knowing the age of the child. Just in some ways, what I would do is really try to understand what the...
They're 13, if that's helpful. Sorry.
Okay, 13. Okay. So really what I would want to know is, what is the obstacle, right? What is it that the child fears will come from taking medication? Or what is it that they fear will be the result of going back to the counselor? Is it that they think that the counseling sessions are so boring that they just won't be able to tolerate sitting there for, hour after hour, week after week after week? Is it that they're afraid that the side effects of the medication will be intolerable? Have they tried medication in the past and found the side effects to be intolerable and weren't sort of heard and listened to and respected when they made that statement? I think that really, especially by the time a child is 13, we really have to focus on getting buy-in, and we really have to focus on, look, my only job here is to make your life easier. I'm not here to torture you. I'm not here to make things harder. I'm not here to give you side effects. I'm here to make your life easier. And if you tell me whether XYZ medicine actually makes things easier or makes things harder, or going to counseling makes things easier or doesn't, and then we work around what we know till we can get to a place where the treatments that we're providing are actually making your life easier, I find that most kids are pretty quick to comply with those plans.
Dr. Varblow, just some follow-up information with this question. It looks like the child, if they do go into services, let it be counseling or medication, they think it's an admission that something is wrong with them. How would you tackle that mindset?
Ah, great. Okay, so there I'm back to the congratulations. There I'm back to, hey, this is good news. Those gifts that you have, those things that you do so well, and I know that there are things that child does well. Those things that they do well because of their ADHD. That is part of the package. The ADHD is not all about things that are wrong with them. The ADHD is about things that are making their lives better, and about some of the things that are making their lives harder. And our job is only to make those hard things easier, not by blaming them, not by trying to change who they are, not by doing anything other than trying to give them self-control. We're not trying to take control away from them. We're trying to give them control. Oftentimes, I think kids, again, especially in this age range, worry that if they take medicine or if they go to counseling, somehow they're giving up some of their own control. And I like to emphasize that, in fact, the opposite is true. The whole point of this exercise is to give them more self-control and let them actually sort of act on the decisions that they feel are right if they have the time to think about it and make choices. And then they can learn from those choices and go on.
Another follow-up question, Dr. Varblow, what resources do you recommend for parents in terms of training for behavior modification?
I would say talk to organizations such as Bridges Therapy and Wellness Center. There are some fabulous therapists out there who do amazing work at training parents in behavior modification. There are authors out there that you could consider reading, such as Edward Hallowell, Hallowell. He does some work on parenting. There's one book in particular called Super Parenting for ADHD, I believe is the title. And there are other resources that you could look into, but I would start with calling Bridges or similar organizations. CHADD is another organization that's phenomenal resource for people, chadd.org.
Another comment from the group, Dr. Varblow. Mary is stating, it's inspiring that ADHD didn't prevent you from becoming a successful doctor. How did you succeed in ADHD since you were diagnosed at 30 years old?
I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was halfway through medical school. I had been able to succeed in the regular sort of classroom style school parts of medical school. But then after the first 2 years, the whole structure of medical school changes, and I was no longer finding success. That's when I was diagnosed. And I would say that for me, understanding what my challenges were and what my strengths were, getting a better understanding of how to leverage my strengths to compensate for my challenges was enormously helpful. And medication has been the other piece that has been life-changing. Other questions? Michaela, is there anything else?
It doesn't look like we have another question from the chat. It just sounds like they're saying thank you. Does anybody else have questions that they'd like to type in the chat or speak up verbally?
If you do have additional questions and we didn't have a chance to go into them this evening, do feel free to reach out to me directly. You see my email address and my website listed there on the slide. Certainly feel free to reach out to me at your convenience, and I'd be happy to arrange time to talk more about any of your questions. I really, really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you tonight. Thank you so much for being such a wonderful audience. And thank you to Dr. Schilling and Dr. Mullally for inviting me.